Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. Hosted by the editors of Writer's Digest, this monthly podcast features conversations with writing and publishing experts whose insights will help ignite your creative vision, hone your skills, build your platform, and get your work out into the world.
Welcome back to Writer's Digest Presents. I'm Senior Editor Robert Lee Brewer, here with Editor-in-Chief Amy Jones, Managing Editor Mariah Richard, and Editor Michael Woodson. For the WD team, and for many poets across the country and around the world, April is Poetry Month, so it only makes sense to focus this episode on poetry. Later in this episode, I'll discuss poetry with a roundtable of poets, but before that, let's chat a little bit about our own experiences with poetry. Hey everyone!
Hi! Hey.
Yeah, so I guess maybe the best place to start with talking about poetry is maybe everyone's first experience with poetry, and we'll start off with writing poetry, because even if a person does not consider themselves a poet, I'm sure everyone has had to perform the exercise of writing a poem at some point in their life. So maybe we'll start with you, Amy. Like, what's your first experience with writing poetry?
I remember I wrote poetry a lot when I was in middle school and high school. It was something that even beyond like the assignments that we would give to each other, I was the person who carried around a journal with me to every class. And when I was bored or frustrated, I would take out my notebook and I would either journal or write poetry. And I thought some of them were like fairly decent for a high school student or a middle school student. So when I got to college, I went to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and I wasn't a literature major and I wasn't a creative writing major, but I took plenty of both of those classes. And I took this poetry class, and I cannot remember what it was called, but we, frequently had to write poetry that was like in response to poems or poets that we were assigned, which was interesting. Like that's an interesting creative exercise to try to mimic or respond to these other poets. But I think like that's actually the class that made me stop writing poetry. And I was telling you all of this when we were preparing for this episode. Like, it was all to do with a comment that the professor left on one of the poems. I had written something that, I hadn't read a lot of contemporary poetry. A lot of the poetry I had read at that point in time was the assigned readings, which are, the classics at that point in time. The canon or whatever. And so what I had written, I thought was creative and unique. And I remember she wrote on the poem in the margin, "This is very cliche," or something to that effect. And she definitely used the word cliche. And I stopped writing poetry after that class. It's something that I've wanted to get back into, but I haven't been brave enough to do it. But at one point I enjoyed it.
Stopped writing ever since?
I haven't written a poem since then. Yeah. And so that's been a good almost 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like when you go to college, like what poetry is before college and what poetry turns into after college. And I'll get to you, Mariah and Michael, in just a moment, but listening to Amy's story actually like reminds me a little bit of like how I started off with poetry. Like there's like a poem that I always wish I could get back from like 5th grade that I wrote for like music class that was probably super cliche, but I wish I had it just because it's like a document of, of like my first poem that I remember being really proud of. But then in high school is when I started also carrying around notebooks and just writing poems. And my models were two places. It was the older rhymey poetry that we learn in English class up to that point. Definitely not the contemporary stuff. And then song lyrics. Like that's my like two places where the poetry came out. And for me, like poetry was definitely like about rhyming and stuff like that. I did have a little bit experience with contemporary poetry because I would buy poetry books randomly when I was in high school, but like a lot of the contemporary stuff I got, I just didn't even know how to enter into it. So like I would get it, read it, and think, I don't even, like my brain doesn't compute like what's going on right now. And that's something that I started working on after I got into college. But I remember when I signed up for my freshman level courses, they said like we could not do like creative writing courses and stuff, but I went ahead and did it anyways and figured they would kick me out
Good for you.
if I'd done something wrong. And I had, plenty of credit hours to keep, to get off to a good start my freshman year. But I remember that first creative writing course, like getting into class, we run through like stuff that you're not supposed to write about, like different cliched stuff. And then we started reading like some different example poems, and like before the end of the class, like I realized, wait a second, none of the poems we're reading, none of them rhyme. There's not one rhymey poem in here, and everything that I've been writing up to this point is rhyming. So I remember leaving and like thinking, I need to figure out how to write poems that don't rhyme. and that became like my challenge for like the rest of the year. And thankfully I didn't. I know, looking back on some of the stuff I wrote, that my initial professor could have given me a harder time than he did. And he did not. And I'm very thankful and grateful for that he allowed us to grow as poets in his class. So, but anyways, Amy, your story reminds me a lot. Like I see a lot of similarities to like how I started as well. I guess we'll jump to Mariah.
I think that I've always written poetry because I was raised by an English teacher, so it was just something that was always kind of in our house, and that she encouraged me to do. But it wasn't until I was in my creative writing program in undergrad, I had a really, really excellent professor who just encouraged us to play as much as possible. So I did a lot of like blurring between the lines of like what is a very short story and what is a poem. But I also took a class with him that was all about poetry forms. And in that class, I don't even remember how it came to be, but I do remember that I wrote a really long paper on color words and how color is used in poems. And it was in writing that paper that I came to think about color as it relates to description across like all written forms, which really transformed the way that I approach any descriptive writing. But then I didn't write poetry for a good many years after that. I was like busy considering myself to be a fiction writer. But I had two friends who lost children, and as a reaction to that trauma, I started writing what were initially meant to be letters to the kids, but ended up being just like journals and journals filled of poems about how I was feeling and how I was processing that trauma and helping my friends to process that trauma. And ever since then, poetry has just become like a thing I do for myself. So that's where I currently am with poetry. I would not consider myself a poet, but I do think that it's a really beautiful personal form that I do enjoy writing.
And how about you, Michael?
Yeah, I don't really have many memories of writing poetry growing up. We had tons of like poetry, sort of children's poetry collections in our house. I think everyone's familiar with Shel Silverstein and I had this book called The Pizza the Size of the Sun that was sort of a knockoff of Shel Silverstein, but I was obsessed with it, and it was just tons of kids' poems for children, and I carried that around everywhere. And it was really college when I started to examine poetry more seriously, and it was also because I was a creative writing major, and I think at the time it was required to take at least a course in outside of what your focus was, and mine was fiction. So I took a creative nonfiction class and a creative poetry class, and the professor was I think a grad student, and he was just brilliant. And it was the first time that I'd ever been asked to like look at each line particularly closely, and also the first time I really heard someone read poetry the right way. And I ended up really loving that class when I thought I was really going to struggle in it, and it was not easy because I do feel more naturally a fiction writer, but I learned a lot about fiction in that class of poetry, and I still don't write poetry very often. And in fact, it's been years, except for last week, actually. I was having intense writer's block with this short story I'm trying to write, but I didn't want to stop writing. I wanted to keep momentum going. And I was like, why don't you just try to write a poem? And I did, and I don't know if it's any good, but it was oddly satisfying because I think it can be difficult to wrap your head around, like, you're not done with this story yet that you've been working on, and to sit down and be able to finish a poem was so utterly satisfying that it really got the creative gears working in my head for my story. So I think it's sort of ebbs and flows for me where I am with poetry, but it's never not helpful.
Yeah, I find that interesting that you use poem to like help break writer's block in a different genre. Like I love to jump genres specifically for that. Like it does help me kind of like using the muscle metaphor. You know, if you're just always using like the same muscles all the time, then like say, you know, you're just always using your arms to do things, eventually it might be hard to walk because
Right.
you're never using your legs or you know, so like sometimes like just writing different forms, even if the goal of writing it isn't to get published or to do big things with sharing it, like I think just using those different muscles sometimes can help unlock other types of writing, like with the fiction. And I know, like personally, like I mentioned like how I got started in poetry, and I went to college and took some creative writing courses in poetry. I made it through my first 2 years. I think I took like 5 different creative writing courses on poetry the first 2 years, and then I turned into a fiction writer, as Mariah mentioned during like her discussion with it, and I like kind of had burnt out on poetry, and for a few years like I couldn't really write it at all. But then I was considering myself like a fiction writer, and I was like winning undergrad awards at our college for writing fiction. So I just started thinking like, this is where I'm going fiction. But then after like getting into the work and everything, getting into work and, you know, real life and all that stuff, I kind of quit writing fiction. And then like it was almost like I was still like writing stuff for work, but like it was almost like I'd quit writing at all. But then poetry like kind of gave me this door where I could sit down, scribble out like 5 to 20 lines and feel like I'd written something. And
Right.
and that's kind of where I went.
Well, I want to go back to what, and I think this ties in, but what Mariah and Michael both said about, like, with Mariah writing to deal with the emotions of trauma and coming to terms with that and thinking about it. And then Michael, what you said about using poetry as a way to break that writer's block. I think both of those things are what I enjoyed and used poetry for when I was younger and I did write poetry. And I feel like that has been something that I have been cut off from all of these years. And I think I would be, this is almost like a therapy session. I feel like I would be a more like self-aware person, and I would get back into that creativity if I did go back to those things that I know worked for me then, that I love to do. And like you said, Robert, make it just for myself and not worry about, showing it to people, or let alone a professor,
Right.
and being critiqued for it, but just using it for myself.
Yeah.
So thanks for that.
Yeah.
My writers group asked me last night, because I met with them and I had them read it, and they were like, what are you going to do with this? And I was like, I think nothing. Like, just thought I'd show you guys what I was working on when I wasn't working on my story. And it was actually nice. It took the pressure off.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I like that about talking about it as therapy as well. I'm glad you caught on to that, Amy, with Mariah talking about it. I have at many times used poetry as a release valve when something overwhelming happens in my life. There are like I've got like two go-tos. Like, one is I like to run energy out, and two, I like to write it out. And usually when I have to write something out, it's like often so overwhelming that I can't like form it into a story. It's more like images and feelings, and like I just have to like kind of get it out and on the page. And poetry is like really well suited to that type of writing, I think. I know people use journaling as well, and like for me, like poetry is almost like the way that I journal.
I would definitely agree with that, because for me, what I find freeing about poetry is that, especially in your like initial drafts, you don't have to be coherent. And I feel like even with something as small as Flash, your sentences have to make sense. And they have to make sense within the whole, where I can just sit down and like jot off a few really random lines, and it might be nothing, or that might be a stanza in a poem that I pull together later, or I can just look at my journal full of like random stuff and be like, oh, here are like 2 or 3 ideas that I kind of see a thread through. Let me pull them together and maybe that will work. But there's also just, sometimes it's nice just to be able to kind of word vomit onto the page. And if that never becomes anything, at least in that moment, I've had that like, oh, I've gotten this feeling out of my body, and it brings me down to like a more neutral, calm place.
I need that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I've had that so often. And I guess the next question, we've talked about like our own writing experiences, is like kind of, does our group like read much poetry? Like, I know that I do, but I know that it's not something that everybody, even people who like to write poetry, don't like to spend a lot of time reading it. But I'm just kind of to get a sense here, because I know that everyone in this group definitely does love reading novels and short stories. I know that for sure. I don't know as much about the poetry side.
I don't read a lot of poetry. Before I prepared to interview Elizabeth Acevedo for the magazine, I hadn't read poetry beyond what was in the Poetic Asides column, really for quite some time. But reading her novels in verse, it brought me back to really enjoying reading poetry. I loved that it sort of meshed those two things in my mind. I love reading the novels, but also what she can do with language in these poems that make up the quote unquote chapters. of these books was just incredible. So I really loved that experience, and that's something that I enjoyed when I was younger and I read poetry. Was I liked reading novels in verse. So I've been reading a little bit more since doing that interview last year. I actually bought a new collection of poetry in the fall and have been reading that. So I'm quite pleased with myself, and I've been enjoying it. I may not understand everything about it, about the poems, and I think that's one of the challenges for me in reading poetry is, not necessarily understanding it, but then I guess that's all relative. It's what I take from it.
I'm the same way, Amy, or I came back to it. It sounds like the same way you did, because I, a few years ago, learned about myself that I love books in verse, and I love Elizabeth Acevedo. I think Jacqueline Woodson is a beautiful novel and verse writer, and I think because of how pervasive social media is now in the world, I come across a lot of poetry in like snippets, because people just post their stuff all the time if they're writing. And there's one collection that I have just more recently gotten into, and I was exposed to her through social media. And it's an interesting take on poetry, should I say, or am I holding on to this, or should I just tell you who I'm talking about?
Oh,
You can
just tell
share.
us.
Okay, cool. Has anyone heard of Kate Bear?
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so either.
She is a poet, and I found her on social media, as did most people, because she takes what internet trolls send her and turns them into poems, and it is unbelievable what she does with them. And is very emotional how she does it, because these are just horrible things people are saying to her, and she turns them into like these really optimistic, beautiful lines of poetry. And she came out with a collection called I Hope This Finds You Well, and it's just so stunning, and is the most recent poetry collection that I have been reading.
That sounds wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's like a real power of poetry is its ability to like make things transformative, and to take
Yes.
something that I think everyone's aware of, the trollish type of things that could be out there, and to turn that into something beautiful that just underlines, what poetry can do.
I was going to say, I just think it's really interesting that you discuss like how important social media is to how you consume poetry, because I am a really big fan of like slam poetry, and even just like I have an addiction to videos of poets reading their work, because I think it's a totally different experience than when you're reading it to yourself privately. So a lot of the poets that I've come across in recent years have all been through Button Poetry, which I follow on Facebook. So like at least every day I'm like reading some kind of like sometimes it's a snippet from somebody's poetry collection, sometimes it's a video of a reading, but I'm always consuming it a little bit every time I log into my social media accounts.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, and I think that's one great thing about social media. A lot of times people talk about the negatives of social media. I love how well suited it is for sharing poetry in its many different forms. That's really cool to hear that Amy and Michael like kind of got back into poetry through like novels and verse. Mariah loves like the slam poetry side. Personally, like I love both of those, but I also love like poetic forms and share a lot of that, like both like more traditional forms, but then like newer forms that people are constantly creating and it's always a surprise and a delight to find like a new form and be like, because every time like I find a form and try it out, I think, okay, like there's not much else anyone can do, but then people always writers find creative new ways to do things. So, and poetry is like one of those cool places that there's so much out there. And, you know, we haven't even talked about like experimental poets who will write an entire like poem with just one vowel, or poets who will write a whole poem without any vowels at all, and do different things like overlaying text, and where it's almost more like an image than it is what I would traditionally call a text document. But it's also so cool, and like that's one thing poetry lets you do.
So that reminds me of when Michael was talking about the poet who took the horrible things that people sent her on social media and like transformed it into something else. There was when I was working on art books, one of the poetry forms that was popular among the artists I was working with was the Blackout Poetry, where you like transform a page of text into something else entirely by blacking it out. And so it was sort of similar to what you said, Robert, more about like the image of the thing. It was an art in two different ways. It was the poem, but also the image that you create. And they would, you know, draw on the blackouts that they had made. They would use black gesso or paint and create these beautiful images that related to the poem that they had written. I love it when people can take one thing and transform it into something else entirely. I love that skill.
Yeah, and something that often moves somebody somewhere.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really where, you know, there's a craft to writing poetry, but there's also like this great art of writing poetry. And, you know, part of it's personal, and then part of it's the part that gets shared with the world. And it's really like there's so many different dimensions to it. And that's why personally, like I love poetry, and that's why I read the intro today because I'm a little bit of a poetry nerd. So I guess, like, you know, we've talked about writing poetry, reading poetry. Would everyone in the group mind like sharing maybe like whether you have like a favorite poem, a favorite collection, or like a favorite poet? And maybe we'll start with you, Amy.
I'm not sure that I can say I have an official favorite poet because I don't feel like I've read enough lately to, you know, to give a solid opinion about that. But there are a couple of poets who I have a collection of their poetry, and I have really enjoyed it, and I would like to read more. And for me, the poets are the ones that I like. It's more about the content and the subject matter of their poems than their skill in writing the form. Although I imagine if I were more well versed in the forms, I would be able to see that in their works, and I would appreciate it. So the first one is British poet James Fenton, and he writes, and I think since the 70s maybe, has written, maybe I'm mistaken about the 70s part, but it's been, because in my mind, the 70s is only like 2 decades ago.
Well, the 90s were like just 5 years ago, so.
Right? Yeah. Exactly. He writes political poems, and it calls out the wars and atrocities that countries commit against each other and their citizens, and that really appeals to me. And I think partially because that was the kind of poetry that I was writing when I was in high school, because I was in high school when the war in Afghanistan began and the war in Iraq began. And so that was weighing really heavily on me. And I think that influenced my appreciation for his subject matter. And then the other one that I've been enjoying, this was the new one that I bought a couple of months ago, William Stafford.
That's a great collection right
The
there.
Darkness Around Us is Deep. I like his poems because they touch on some personal experiences in my life and take me to thinking about certain people that I love. Who I love, excuse me.
Okay, we'll jump over to you, Mariah.
So, like, thinking about my all-time favorite poets, I would say my favorite poem is The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, even though that's like, I feel like that's such a lit kid thing to say. But my mom read me that poem when I was very young. And I remember that's the first time that I was ever like obsessed with a single author. I wanted to read everything that he'd ever written. And another one of my like comfort favorites is Pablo Neruda. But thinking about like more current poets, anything that Rachel Wiley has ever written just absolutely blows me away. And she's another one of those poets that I just love to see her perform her work. I think it is a skill to be able to perform your work in a way that like really moves a crowd. And she's just an expert at it. And then fairly recently in our Breaking In column, I was able to feature Paul Tran's All the Flowers Kneeling. And let me tell you, I have not been so excited about a debut poetry collection in a while. So if you're interested in poetry, I really highly recommend that one giving a read. And even if you're not, I think that it's just so beautifully written and so emotional that every reader could take something from at least one of the poems.
Wow, actually can't wait to read that now. I also was very obsessed with The Raven when I was growing up. I had a teacher in middle school who read it to us one day for a lesson, and he read it so powerfully that I don't want to say forced, but we like begged him to read it again, and he read it immediately again, and it just had an impact on all of us. And I went down a deep Edgar Allan Poe hole and loved him. And another one that is an annoying answer, I really loved Robert Frost when I was in college, and his work really did influence a lot of my fiction writing I do, because I just love the way he writes about nature, and I love writing nature, which is annoying and boring, and I get it. To say, okay, Robert Frost. Everyone loves Robert Frost. But more contemporary stuff, like I said, I love Kate Bear. And then someone else that I'm really loving is, and I hope I'm pronouncing their name right, Alok. They are a performance poet, and the way that they perform their poetry is a very important aspect of reading it. I love the way that they use language, and a lot of their work is based on gender identity and politics, and sort of the cross section of the two, and it's always just really powerful and impactful.
Yeah, those are all great. I second the Robert Frost. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening is like a perfect poem. There aren't many poems that you can say are like perfect, even like the great poems, but I always think that one is like a perfect poem. If I ever wrote one poem that was as good as that, I would think, wow, it was all worth it. And The Raven as well, like, it's cool to hear all the Raven love. I have read that to my children so many times, and I always think this time they're going to tell me not to read it anymore. but they always let me keep reading it to them. So
Yeah.
I have like just a little anecdote about the Raven. So in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, every fall there is a like Edgar Allan Poe fest.
Oh my gosh.
That happens where it's like a single night. Well, it's one night, but you can go over the course of a few weeks. Like they do more than one performance, and like there is an actor there who is playing Edgar Allan Poe, and you sort of like shuffle from room to room, and they do dramatic readings. But there was one year where he was, obviously Richie and I go every year.
Yeah, of course.
But there was one year in particular where he was not the Edgar Allan Poe actor that we had seen before. And it was just him on a stage with like, it was like a desk and like a little fake raven and just these like red velvet curtains. But the way that he read the poem, like, and it's a poem I've read a million times and I've heard read a million times, but I was weeping at the end.
I've got chills, Mariah.
And so it's just like, I think it's one of those really interesting things about poetry is that, like, depending on who is performing it, like, it can really hit you differently.
Totally.
So,
it can.
Okay, sorry. I love that you're saying this because, okay, so Gilmore Girls has had a chokehold on me since the year 2000. Like, I can't give it up. And one of my favorite episodes is in season 3, where like the Edgar Allan Poe Society come, and they have this whole thing, and that immediately reminded me of it because it's such a delightful little episode. Anyway, nothing to do with what we're talking about.
That's great. Well, my wife might listen to this episode of the podcast now that there's a Gilmore Girls reference to it. So
Okay, perfect. She might. Wow, what an endorsement.
she will. But yeah, so I'm not trying to dodge my own question, but like as far as contemporary poets, like it's really hard for me to like just choose even 10. So I'm just not even going to try because I've worked with so many of them. But the poem part of it, my favorite poem, and this is actually how I introduced, I guess the Poetic Asides blog does not really exist anymore. It's just poetry, content that's on writersdigest.com. But our poetry content on the site started off as a blog, Poetic Asides, and my first post had the opening lines from the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock from T.S. Eliot. And it's like one of those poems that like I fell in love with the opening lines and then had to start figuring out what the whole poem meant because I was so in love with it from the very beginning. And it's just like even when you may not understand fully what it means the first time reading through, you feel this tension between like this is supposed to be a love song, but there's also like all these images that just don't feel right, and untangling all that, and that's something I think like great poetry does. It's juxtaposes like all these different emotions to where sometimes you might not even know what you feel. And to get back to that point about different people reading the same poem having different impacts, great poetry means something different when you're a teenager versus when you're in your 30s versus like now that I'm in my 40s. As I get older, I'm sure coming back to the same poems, I'll have a completely different interpretation on them as we go along. And that's just great poetry. I guess this feels a little self-promotional, but this is our poetry episode, and I feel like I would be remiss not to mention our annual April Poem a Day challenge that we do on the website. as you're listening to this, April is already starting to wind down, but we love people to join at any point during the month. And what we do for the April Poem a Day Challenge is basically I provide a prompt each morning, usually like around 3 o'clock in the morning. I provide an example poem, and I just go into it realizing that it's my first draft and that it's a first draft. And then I implore other poets and poets from around the world, around the country, and around the world participate every year. And I always feel so humbled by it. But they share their poems in the comments. And there are also poets who do not share their poems in the comments, but they write poems at home and keep it tucked away. And all are welcome. So just go to writersdigest.com to participate in that. And through the month of April, one of the first few posts each day will be an April Poem a Day Challenge prompt. So please check that out.
I do want to briefly mention I participated in last year's April Poem a Day Challenge. But because I mostly do write poetry for myself, I did not share a lot of my work, but I kind of popped in and out of the comments over the course of the month. And the poems that I did leave, I got some really like wonderful feedback, and the community just really like celebrated and embraced me. And it's a very open, easy vibe in our Writer's Digest online community. So even if you are coming late to the challenge by the time you hear this episode, like please don't hesitate to participate. Everyone's welcome, and we're all excited to see your work.
Yeah, and it's definitely meant to be a celebration of poetry. It's meant to be fun, not to be critical or make people second guess their poetry writing abilities. It's definitely a place to build up and to have fun. So, all right. Well, thanks so much. I always love these chances for us to talk together about different topics. I always learn something new about everyone. So that's great. This is Robert Lee Brewer, and I've assembled a round table of poets to share some poems and discuss all things poetry, which covers about everything in the universe, so we'll have plenty to talk about. I have with me Kelli Russell Agodon, Kim Dower, Timothy Greene, and Joseph Mills. So here's what I'm thinking to get things started. I'll just introduce a poet, and then said poet can read a poem. Then I will introduce the next poet, and we'll just go through it that way, and then we'll get into our conversation. So using a super complicated formula called the alphabet, I'm going to start off with Kelli Russell Agodon. Kelli Russell Agodon's newest book is Dialogues with Rising Tides from Copper Canyon Press. She is co-founder of Two Sylvias Press, where she works as an editor and book cover designer. She teaches at Pacific Lutheran University's low-res MFA program, the Rainier Writing Workshop, and is an avid paddleboarder and hiker. Learn more at www.agodon.com.
Thank you, Robert. I'm going to be reading a poem today about trying to love the world, and it is from Dialogues with Rising Tides. It's called Love Waltz with Fireworks. 17 minutes ago, I was in love with the cashier and a cinnamon pull-apart. 7 minutes before that, it was a gray-haired man in argyle socks, a woman dancing outside the bakery, holding a cigarette and broken umbrella. The rain, I've fallen in love with it many times. The fog, the frost, how it covers the clovers, and by clovers, I mean lovers. And now I'm thinking how much I want to rush up to the stranger in the plaid wool hat and tell him how much I love his eyes. All those fireworks, every 17 minutes, exploding in my head. You the baker, you the novelist, you the reader, you the homeless man on the corner with the strong hands. I've thought about you. But in this world, we've been taught to keep our emotions tight. A rubber band ball, we worry. If one band loosens, the others will begin shooting off in so many directions. So we quiet. I quiet. I eat my cinnamon bread in the bakery, watching the old man still sitting at his table, moving his napkin as he drinks his small cup of coffee. And I never say, I think you're beautiful, except in my head, except I decide I can't live this way and walk over to him and place my hand on his shoulder, lean in close and whisper, I love your Argyle socks. And he grabs my hand the way a memory holds tight in the smallest corner. He smiles and says, I always hope someone will notice. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Okay, well, we're going to move on to Kim Dower. Kim Dower, former City Poet Laureate of West Hollywood, is author of 5 collections of poetry. Midwest Book Review says her newest, I Wore This Dress Today for You, Mom, is deftly constructed, impressively insightful, thought-provoking, and truly memorable. Dower teaches poetry workshops for Antioch University, UCLA Extension, and the Hollywood LGBT Senior Center. Learn more at www.kimdowerpoetry.com.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Robert. And that was beautiful, Kelli. Just beautiful. I'm going to read a poem called I Wore This Dress Today for You, Mom. That is the title poem of my new book that's coming out, I think, the day this show airs, April 19th. And I'm very excited about that. And I believe, Tim, that this poem was first published in Rattle a long time ago. So the poem has its little life of its own, and it's going to be the title of the new book I have that's poems all about mothers and motherhood. I wore this dress today for you, Mom. Breezy, floral, dancing with color, soft, silky, flows as I walk. Easter Sunday, and you always liked to get dressed. Go for brunch. Maybe there's a good movie playing somewhere. Wrong religion. We were not churchgoers, but New Yorkers who understood the value of a parade down Fifth Avenue, bonnets in lavender, powder blues, pinks, hues of spring, the hope it would bring. We had no religion, but we did have Noodlekugel, grandparents, dads who could fix fans, reach the china on the top shelf, carve the turkey. That time has passed. You were the last to go, Mom, and I still feel bad I never got dressed up for you like you wanted me to. I had things to do. But today in LA, hot the way you liked it, those little birds you loved to see, flitting from tree to tree, just saw one, a twig in its mouth, preparing a bed for its baby, might still be an egg. I wish you were here. I've got a closet filled with dresses. I need to show you.
Oh, that's great. And I had no idea that that was originally published in Rattle. So that's I always love those small
Yep.
small world things that happen with poetry like that. And how appropriate that the next poet is Timothy Greene. Timothy Greene has worked as editor of Rattle magazine since 2004. He's the author of one book of poetry, American Fractal, which was published by Red Hen Press, and co-founder of the Wrightwood Arts and Wine Festival. He lives with his wife, Megan, and their 2 children in the mountains near Los Angeles.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me out. It's a lot of fun and great to see all your faces. So the only thing I write these days is prompt poems, basically. And I'm just kind of in heaven because once a week we have our podcast and there's a prompt at the end of every week. And so I get to write a poem every week. And that's kind of all I really wanted out of poetry anyway. And so some weeks they're serious and some weeks they're more fun. I think last year we had William Trowbridge, who has those great old guy superhero poems. And the prompt for that week was to write your own superhero. And so this is Poetry Man Wins the Battle. Poetry Man wins the battle, but at home the dishes still stack in the sink, near the sink in reckless stanzas. Past due notices pile by the door like so many rejection letters, their SAEs not even stamped. How he'd spend hours changing commas to periods, paring each digit's expression down to its essence. Crime doesn't pay, but neither do poems, is all they say. But poetry should only be used for good, in fighting his old nemesis, Professor Prose. Poetry Man plops onto the couch and clicks on the news, hoping to compose as weekly poets respond. And there he is again, the professor, in eyewitness iPhone footage. Half his lines are already broken by a relentless pair of iambic feet, but his blocky, symmetrical face stares straight into Poetry Man's studio apartment. You may have won this time, Poetry Man, he says, but one day you'll see that we agree. Even if I rhyme half the time, it's all just prose with line breaks. Then he laughs maniacally as they stuff him into a squad car, and Poetry Man and jams the TV.
And jams the TV. Love it. That's great. Our next poet, the last one, but only because alphabetically, that's how it works out, is Joseph Mills, a faculty member at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. Joseph Mills holds the Susan Burris Wall Distinguished Professorship in the Humanities. He has published 7 volumes of poetry, most recently Bodies in Motion, Poems About Dance. More information about his work is available at www.josephrobertmills.com.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for having me. And this, very clever system alphabetically. Usually, that puts me right in the middle as Mills. I don't think I've ever been either in the front or the back before, so this is a new experience for me.
I think I'm as surprised as you are. That just happened to work out that way.
And it's wonderful to hear the other poets. I'm glad when I was younger I wasn't judged on the company I keep, but I hope I am now, because to be with you is really a rewarding experience today. So I'm going to read a poem called Set Pieces. It's in my most recent book. I wrote a book of poems that have to do with dance in some way, called Bodies in Motion, that just came out this year. This is called Set Pieces. Choreographers talk about setting a work on dancers, as if it's something they carry, and we admire how they carry themselves and carry the art, beautiful bodies in space. As for the rest of us, the overweight and short-legged and clumsy, the aging and awkward, we too carry what is set on us, movements we haven't designed, trying to do them as fluidly as possible for as long as possible until the steps we can achieve get smaller, less complex, and we begin to forget them altogether. This may seem facile, but only for those who know little of art, who believe myths like Astaire and Rogers improvised easily, when in fact they did takes until she bled. To consider life as a dance is to hope that there is a choreographer who has some sort of vision and an audience who appreciates the effort. It's to believe we can carry what is set upon us with grace and beauty. It may be a lie, like all art. It may simply be the work we decide to do, or it may be something imperfectly understood, like how birds turn together just above the waves, making sinuous patterns as they migrate to some distant, unknown destination.
Awesome. So, like, I'm love all those. They're all coming in different, like, kind of directions. One of the things I love about poetry is the versatility, and that if we had a 2,000 poet roundtable, which would technically probably be very difficult to pull off, we would probably just have this wide variety of voices come through and styles. And anyway, I think maybe the best place to start off, and this actually kind of lines up with Tim's poem, is to maybe give your origin story with poetry. For example, while I read and wrote poetry before I started to kind of move into where I considered myself a poet, whatever that means, for me, like, it was writing a love poem to a girl that I was trying to woo in high school. And what started off as, romance for a specific person turned into a romance with writing, and just falling in love with it to where I started filling up composition notebooks, and the poetry has stuck with me over the years. So we can do this alphabetically. We can reverse the alphabet and start with Joe. Maybe we'll do that. And everyone, if you could kind of give a brief overview of your origin story.
Why now reverse alphabetical? Now I liked being last to read, but I don't like being first here. And like you say, all the poems are different. But even as you were reading, I was thinking, should I read this one? Oh, Kim just wrote a poem about her mother. I want to read a poem about my mother. Oh, I do poems that are prompts. So I think we all have, in the course of our careers, a variety of kind of different poems in certain ways. And we do have careers, most of us, kind of long things. So I didn't grow up knowing any poets. I was the first person in my family to go away to college. And if I would have said I wanted to be a poet, I would have been supported, but it would have been like, I want to be an astronaut or a space alien or a waterfall. It's like, great, go do it. We don't know how that works, but feel free. And I certainly had no intention of doing that. And it was, to be absolutely honest, I thought vaguely I wanted to be a writer, but in the way that people think about being a writer rather than actually writing. And I was in college, and I was late, as always, for registering for courses. And a course had just opened up that I could actually get into, which was writing poetry. And so I signed up because there were slots. And I think usually you had to submit a portfolio, but there was very few students, so they let me in. And I'm delighted that most of my work is pre-internet. So all of those poems and everything that I would have been tempted if I was young today to post are all gone. And I hope they never appear again, because I was just writing horrible stuff that I thought, well, this is what a poem is, right? This model I had from 200, 300 years ago. I think I was writing about flowers, and I knew nothing about flowers. I had no idea. But then I kind of kept doing it. In my 30s, I really started to write more poems because I had the time to do this, to fit them in my days. And then in my 40s, it's like I started writing poems that I was like, oh, I like that. Well, that's good. And I'm getting better and better as I go. I love prompts. I love those kind of challenges. And I love using poems to kind of discover things. But, it was my third book, and my wife was like, when are you going to call yourself a poet? I'm like, well, I'm not a poet. I'm just somebody who writes a bunch, and then things build up over time, and you've got a body of work that you did.
Great. Tim?
Well, I was a molecular biology major at the University of Rochester, and I didn't have any sort of intention on being a poet at all, and I thought maybe it'd be fun to be like a science fiction, writer on the side. And so I was taking elective classes, and I just happened to take a poetry class with James Longenbach, who was just amazing. I had no idea who he was at the time. It was just there. It was freshman year of college, I think the first semester. And I just loved having, writing a poem once a week. It's just like this meditative thing. It's like yoga for your brain, or like the Wordle or something, but you get to save what you made out of it or something. It's a great exercise. And I just loved it. I love that experience of like learning things about yourself and about the world that you didn't know you knew. And I just loved having to write a poem once a week for that workshop. And then so I took the next workshop and then the next workshop. And then I was like, oh, I'll dual major in English. And then eventually I just ended up doing that all the time. And so then I got a job, editing a magazine. So it just kind of fell in. It's a strange year. I never thought I'd end up here on a podcast for Writer's Digest.
Awesome. Kim.
Oh, I was involved in listening to everybody's stories. Well, I'll join Joe and Tim in freshman year of college. Although I will say that I was a Dr. Seuss and A. Milne addict, and I memorized all of those and would force my dolls to listen to me read these little rhyming poems. I do credit Dr. Seuss for my love of, and I would write little things, but of course we don't think they're anything. On freshman year of college, I took an elective called Introduction to Creative Writing, and I was the luckiest person in the world because the teacher was Thomas Lux. And Thomas Lux, it was his first class teaching ever. So I feel it's like growing up with the Beatles. I mean, the timing was just right. You couldn't have wished for anything better than that. And on day one, we were scared and I didn't know what was going on. And he was very aggressive as a teacher that at the beginning used to wear a suit jacket and a tie. And he declared us all poets. He said, everyone in this room is a poet and you have a responsibility to tell the world the way you see it. And he sort of gave us literally poetic license. And that was it for me. I mean, that was it. It was a poem a day every day. And I stayed there and I had great, great teachers throughout those years. Paul Hannigan, William Matthews, Bill Knott. I mean, how lucky can you get? And but then something happened, and I was writing, I was sending out, I was encouraged. I taught creative writing at Emerson for 2 years, and then guess what? I moved to Los Angeles, and it was the death of me. No, it wasn't. It was great, but I stopped. I stopped writing poetry. And I tried to write all these other things, and I got a job, and then I started a company, and I had a baby, and then I stopped writing for 20 years. And when my son left for college, I started writing again. And the poems came back fast and furious, 10 a week. It was glorious. And I wrote to Tom Lux and he said, well, the warranty has expired. That was how funny he was, but he told me, go to workshops. You still got your humor, you still got the whimsy, but you need the craft. So I went to every single writing workshop I could find all over the place, in LA, all over the country, and I started getting it back. And happiest days of my life are when I'm writing poems, which is pretty much all the time.
Yeah, and another small world moment, I remember talking with Thomas Lux once after reading on a local poetry stage here in Atlanta, and the nicest guy, long conversation with him about my kids, my poetry, I gave him my email address, and I just thought it was somebody in the crowd, like just who liked poetry. And I found out later from my wife, who pays attention to this stuff, she's like, oh my gosh, you were spending forever talking to Thomas Lux. And I was like, really? Okay. But such a nice, sincere guy though, because like he didn't put on any airs or let me know that he was Thomas Lux when we were talking. So cool stuff. Small world again. So Kelli, your origin story.
Yeah, this has been wonderful to listen to, everyone. I was interested in poetry in high school, and I went to public school. So the poetry class I got was taught by an ex-DJ, and we looked at the lyrics from Pink Floyd, and tried to write from that and write. So when I went to college, I really had I knew Shakespeare, and I knew Plath, but I didn't know a lot about that there were poets actually alive and living in the world. So I became a fiction writer at the University of Washington. And like Joe, my father went to college, but I was the youngest of six girls. And so I was the first to go to college. And my dad just said, doesn't matter what you major in, just finish. He goes, that's all they're going to look at your resume. And I'm like, okay, I like English. I almost switched to communications. I went to the department and they're like, well, what do you like? And I said, I like to write. And he's like, then write. So I was a fiction writer and I took a class with Linda Beards, and Tom Hunley, who runs Steel Toe Press, was in that class. And I never looked back. I stopped writing fiction and started writing poetry. And then kind of built my life around that. I graduated and thought, well, I know there was a Linda Beards who was writing poems, but she was teaching and I didn't really want to teach. So I got a corporate job. And then I realized how much I hated corporate jobs and just started saving a lot of money and moved to a very small town about 6 months before I was fully vested, and tried to live a life as a poet there. And then from there on, it was just a little bit like Kim is. So I had a baby when I was 30. And then what was happening was people weren't seeing me as a poet. It was kind of like a hobby. And so I thought, well, if I want people to take this serious, I'm going to throw a lot of money at it. So I went back and got my MFA. And I feel like my whole life has just been trying to find ways to live as a poet, whatever that means. Like, my younger years, I was selling stuff on eBay and trying to, make money that way. But it's just something that's always remained constant in me. It's the one thing I can look back and always see it was there, where there's a lot of other things that were just kind of phases, like mountain biking. But this has always been with me.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I often do not describe myself as a poet to people that I don't know are writers. Like, I don't share it because a lot of times, like, the reactions can really be all over the map when people hear that I write poetry. In fact, even if I say I'm a writer, a lot of times they're like, yeah, okay, like, that's a cool hobby that you write. And interestingly enough, even if I say I'm an editor, a lot of times people will ask, like, what's your job? I say editor, and they're like, shut off. Like, okay, let's talk about something else, anything else. But and I don't know if that's because they think I'm going to spell check their talking or what, but it's interesting. I've noticed while reading the poems, but also during the origin stories, more. I know at least 3 of you, maybe all 4 of you, had mentioned poetry prompts, and I was just like kind of interested in, do all of you use poetry prompts? I know that Tim will share them. I know Kelli shares them, like in a guide. You usually have like an April guide, right?
Yeah,
of
to
like 30
Sylvia's.
poetry prompts. I know that Joe's written to some of my prompts on the Writer's Digest site before. I don't know what order to go in here, but what's everyone's thoughts on poetry prompts, whether sharing them or writing to them?
Well, I never wrote to prompts before we started doing the Rattlecast, but now I steal your prompts all the time. And Megan, my wife and our assistant editor, compiles prompts once a week. And I just, it goes back to that. It's this meditative thing that we do as poets, and having somewhere to jump off from. It doesn't really matter, where it ends up going. Just having something to kind of focus your attention at first is really helpful, I think. And then for the podcast that we do, just having people, seeing different takes, like, a dozen or 2 dozen different takes on one prompt is always a lot of fun too. It's kind of ties everything together. So I just love that aspect of it. And that's what I loved taking poetry workshops in college, was just that you get some kind of thing to start with. And then at the end of the week, you get to see what everyone else did with that idea. It's just a sort of it makes this sort of the very private thing very communal at the same time, which I just enjoy it a lot.
I love prompts, but I use, as Tim said, the most interesting thing to me when I'm teaching and to just illustrate to the students or the poets, that I teach adults, so they're not really students, but is to show the diversity that one line can create, 20 completely different takes on something, which proves, the poetry. It's like Amy Gersler says, if you say you don't like poetry, it's like saying you don't like food, because there's something for everyone. And as we all demonstrated today, I mean, our poems are different, our styles are different, what we write about. But my prompts, my tried and true prompts, are headlines from the newspaper and stories I hear on the radio. I can't tell you how many poems I've written. I heard a newscast, they're taking chocolate milk off the menu. And I just pulled over and wrote a poem based on their taking chocolate milk off the menu. Or, the nudists are getting ready to pack was a headline in the LA Times when they were closing a nudist colony in the desert. And I thought, thank you, for that. So I get a lot of prompts right out of the headlines. And I give my students always find a headline this week and write a poem based on it. So prompts are great.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the news prompt, because one of my old professors, Sestina writer Jim Cummins, that was always one of his assignments in workshop at some point, was going to News of the Weird and finding some kind of weird headline and going from there with your poem. Kelli.
Well, since I wrote The Daily Poet, which is 365 prompts with Martha Solano, I kind of am a prompt person. And I liked what Tim said about it, which I think is kind of what makes prompts magical, is everyone arrives to it, but because we're all so different in how we interpret things and how we do it, that our poems just go off in different directions. That's why I find them really useful. And I know, especially during the pandemic, people have been wanting them, because at Two Sylvias, we've had poets who kind of have lost track of time in their writing time, have been asking us, like, can you give us prompts? So we started a new service in May. We're going to start it where we send like a prompt, 2 prompts a week to everyone's email, and then some other information to help people stay on track. But the pandemic has been a time where I ended up in a poetry group every Thursday night with Marty Solano and Rhonda Broach, and we would each bring prompts, and they were getting crazier and crazier as the pandemic went on, like surrealist prompts where they would ask bizarre questions like, the moon is a light bulb, what do you turn off? Martini. And and we'd be like, okay, we're writing from this. So yeah, they're definitely something I use, and I sometimes a poem comes from like another source, which feels magical, but a lot of times it just comes from this play.
Yeah, and that's a good point about the pandemic, is at times for me personally, it's been difficult to write, depending on what's going on in the world each week. And I always feel like kind of lucky that I do such a public weekly prompt on the Writer's Digest website, because I always have the prompts, but then I always have like a poem to get people started. So I'm kind of forced to try to like re-trigger that part of my brain. And of course, like a lot of the poems are horrible, but it at least like forces me back into that space each week. And I always feel kind of lucky about that. Joe.
Well, I want to take a contrary position and just rail against prompts and say that prompts are, everything I don't believe in, but I love prompts, and I've done many of my books, Robert, came from your challenges where I'll have a subject and then I will use the prompts to kind of explore the subject in different ways, whether it's writing about kind of wine or writing about dance or writing out. And then those prompts give you a place to start. And then, you're not bound by the prompt. You can pull it away if you don't like it, and you can end up somewhere else. That will have been the initial kind of impetus. And they are fun. They give you a push down the hill. I mean, I am a real fan of prompts. And there's also the sense of play. I, at one point, had a project. I couldn't decide if I was going to write the prompts I was going to use were the spam headers for spam in my junk mail, because I love those headers. And I was like, oh, I should make these into poems. Or I was rereading Shakespeare, and the stage directions in Shakespeare can be so crazy and wonderful. Most famous, Exit Pursued by a Bear. But there's another one, Enter a Messenger with, 2 heads and a hand. It's like all the violence is right there, right? So I started writing those, using them as prompts, and it was fun and playful. And I thought to myself, this is really stupid. I didn't think, this is a great idea, this is so serious. I thought, this is really dumb, but I'm really enjoying it. So let's see how far we can go with it. And I think there has to be that sense of not even trying to write a poem. I'm just putting words down to see what will happen. Some days nothing does, and some days something wonderful happens, and that gets you moving.
Yeah, I like that thought process. It's something I always try to promote a little bit with the different challenges that we do is, if you want to write serious stuff, that's great, but try not to do it in the first draft. Like, even if you're writing serious stuff in the first draft, try not to take it too seriously in the first draft. Just get the ideas out there, and then you can start chiseling away and crafting it and shaping it. But I mean, that might just be me. It might just be Joe just mentioned it. Kim, how do you feel on that? Like, especially with first drafts?
Yeah, I mean, it's never the same thing. It's like they say, every pregnancy is different. Every poem is different. There's no rule. There's no way that it is. If things get too comfortable, it's probably not right. I mean, I've literally been pulled by deep, deep, deep sadness. I see something on the street, or I read something, or suddenly a feeling literally comes over me. I was standing in my garden once, watering the roses, and I literally felt my father's presence. I mean, I felt him looking at the roses, and he's dead, and I just thought, my God, he would love these roses. And I was pulled by this very intense sadness, and I ran into the house, and I ran to my computer, and I wrote. And I will say, it's pretty much the poem that I kept. It came out so full and complete and rich immediately that even when I tried to make myself edit it and change it, I thought, you nailed it. And it was from this real emotion. Oh, there are other times I could want to write a serious poem, and it will never work. It's just bad. Nothing I can do will help it. It's just like wrong. And so you never know when it's going to come through you. Like Anne Sexton used to say, her poems come from God. They just come inside of her. And, everyone has their own way of thinking how a poem comes, but it can come, it can be really hard, months of editing, or it can just be suddenly there. I call it a poem push. It just comes out. It's like a miracle. So all different ways.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, definitely. Tim.
Yeah, I just think play is such an important aspect of all creativity. I think it's really central to it. And I always say that Zen and the Art of Archery is probably the best book about writing or about any kind of art. And there's this whole sections about how the right art is purposeless and aimless. And so I pulled up this quote because I just love this. And this is how I think about writing poems or doing anything creative. And this is from Zen and the Art of Archery. You must hold the drawn bowstring like a little child holding a proffered finger. It grips it so firmly that one marvels at the strength of the tiny fist, and when it lets the finger go, there is not the slightest jerk. Do you know why? Because a child doesn't think, I will now let go of the finger in order to grasp this other thing. Completely unselfconsciously, without purpose, it turns from one to the other. And we would say that it was playing with the things were it not completely true that the things were playing with the child. And I think that's what the state that we get into when we're creating, when making art, is that the art is playing with us, you know? And I think like we do a young poets anthology of poets age 15 and younger. And when they're around age 8 or 9, they are just so playful and creative. And I always feel like we as adults are trying to get back to that space where we're just playing with words and learning our way through the world and making something. And I think that's what we do. And when I first published a book, American Fractal is my only book, and it's 12 years old or 13 years old now, from Red Hen Press. And it was sort of like depressing after I published it, because it became like a serious thing. And it took a long time to get back to that sense of like it not being a careerish thing and just being play again. And that's actually to get back to the prompts. That's what the prompts helped with, was just letting yourself play with words and language and creativity again, like a child would.
Yeah, and that's a good point about after like the first book coming out and feeling kind of it's funny, like you're kind of excited, but you're also kind of feel this emptiness that it's out there, or at least for me. And a good point about like the kids, as a father of 5, I totally like, I see like their creativity each time they get to that sweet spot between like where they know how to write and then they start writing things, and like some of the combinations of thoughts and ideas that come together. I'm like, whoa, like this is it's just amazing to watch, and it's something I keep trying to encourage my kids as they get older, not to fall out of that super creative bringing things together that I would never think of bringing together type stuff.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting about reading the submissions, is you can see where they drop off into self-consciousness. It's always around like age 12 or 13 or something. And then, and you know, in the poet's that age, they start to write, you know, what they think you want to hear, and they try to make things poetic, whereas kids under like don't have that self-consciousness. And so like Elizabeth Bishop calls art the self-forgetful, perfectly useless concentration. And I think that's what kids have spontaneously and naturally when they're young, and then we lose it. Then we have to find it again, and then we get such excitement out of finding it when we do, because our regular lives are so full of monotony and bills and all sorts of things, and finding that childlike aspect is what we're. I don't know. It feels to me like what we're all after. Although I shouldn't talk in generalities, but that's what it feels like to me.
Well, it's interesting because I teach at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts, where we're trained professional artists, dancers, and musicians and actors, and they all struggle with this, that they took something that they loved and had a passion about, and now they're trying to do it professionally, and you lose your love. That monetizes a bit. I remember I had somebody come up to me once and said, "Well, if I do write a poem, like what will I get?" And then in case I didn't know what he meant, he kind of rubbed his thumb and his finger together, like how much? And I just cracked up. It was like, well, you'll get the pleasure of writing a poem, which is wonderful, but you're not going to make much money. But this idea of like, well, this is serious stuff, and it has to be serious, and that will then kind of distort it. It's for me, it's really wonderful that I don't have a lot of expectations when I publish a poem. I don't think people are going to read it. Somebody once quoted a poem to me, and I thought they were mocking me. I was like, wait, you're quoting my own work? Are you making fun of me? Because it's like, I don't expect people to read it. And that's actually really liberating. That means I can kind of do what I want. Last week, somebody said, what do you want your readers to get out of your poem? And I answered, I don't know. I got something writing it. I don't know what you'll get reading it. And I guess, Robert, to go back to the serious, funny thing, I don't ever think of writing this is serious or this is funny. Although sometimes I'll see my students try to be serious, try to be poetic, as Tim said. Sometimes it'll be funny unintentionally, and when I read it, people will laugh, and I'll be like, I guess that line is funny. I wasn't going for a laugh, but you're trying to see what the work wants to be, and then it will adopt that kind of tone. But, you know, I think we do distort it when we're like, this is pretty serious stuff. This is going to be really moving, right? I'm going to push, and that always distorts it.
Yeah, and I think that I probably communicated it a little bit poorly, but yeah, just being a little bit like trying to be unconscious, I guess, a little bit when you're doing that first draft, not thinking about the final state that it's going to be in, more just, you know, this, I'm thinking of that Saturday Night Live skit with the more cowbell, you know, just explore the space, and and then you can figure out what space looks like afterwards. Um, I guess, you know, we're getting near the end, and I don't want to put people on the spot, but I'm wondering, and I'll give you all like a second to think about this, and you can raise your hand if you have an idea of who would fit this. But I'm wondering if each of you could maybe suggest a poet that you really enjoy. You know, poetry, in a sense, is such a small world where, you know, we do have like these different connections that happen, but in another way, it's a very vast world to where I might have like 2 or 3 poets that I love, but if I meet other people who read poetry, they might have never heard of them. So, if you can think of like maybe one poet that you would like to share with the world, who would that poet be? And if you have a name that comes to mind, Kelli, we'll let you go
I
first.
do. Melissa stuttered, and she has a new book out called Dear Selection Committee, and she comes to poetry with so much play. It was like what you're talking about, the first drafts. You can just see the energy in her work, and you just never know what to expect with her. So she would be mine. Melissa stuttered.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. There's so many poets that I don't know. I mean, I'm a huge Bob Hickok fan, so I love everything he does. Patricia Smith is just amazing in her variety and the way she delivers things, and also, you know, evolves and does amazing things. It's impossible. I don't know. I mean, I interview a new poet every week on our podcast, and it's just amazing poet after amazing poet, and it never ends. So it's picking out one. I just can't. I have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, I too have so many. It's hard to pick one, but I'm a big fan of the New York school. Have always been. So Frank O'Hara was one of my first favorites, and he remains one of my favorites. And speaking of playful and fun, Frank O'Hara, Ron Padgett, to be funny but with such a serious underside. Conversational poetry has always been my thing, but I've recently discovered, though, I've been reading her for years, but I'm really stuck on Ellen Bass these days, just Bass, Ellen Bass, and she recently did an interview in the Writer's Chronicle, which blew my mind, and she talks a lot about how the just minutia, you know, seeing every single detail in the world as a poem and what it can be. It's something that I try to do. You know, it's like Jerry Seinfeld's show. The show's about nothing, you know, and the poem's about nothing, but it's about everything. That to me is a great poem. Just what are you talking about? But Ellen Bass is great, is a great poet that people should read.
And I'm just going to echo what everybody said. There's so many poems and poets that we can mention, and I'm going to apologize in advance if these poets hear their names and I've mangled their names, because I've only seen their names written, so I don't know how to pronounce some of their names. But there's a poet, Stacy Nigliazzo. She is an emergency room nurse and a hospital nurse, and she writes a lot about healthcare in her poetry, and I find that really moving and wonderful. She has a new book coming out. I find every time I run across one of his poems, I love him. It's George Bilgere, Bilgere. I don't know how you pronounce it, but he is hilarious, and I love his work. And Rita Duff, you know, again and again, I find myself going back to her work.
Great. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up here. For people who are listening and or viewing this, links and biographical information for each of the poets on this round table are located somewhere close by. And thank you all so much for coming on here. It's really great to have an episode of this podcast that's dedicated solely to poetry. I feel like a lot of the time we're talking about fiction, nonfiction, writing techniques for Writer's Digest, so it's great to just have one that's just all poetry. And I hope to see you all again sometime soon. For this episode's writing prompt, write a response piece. If you pen poetry, write a poem that responds to a story. The poem could be written in the voice of a character or describe a scene in the story. If you prefer to write fiction or nonfiction, write a piece that responds to a popular poem. You may even choose to use a few lines as an epigraph at the beginning of your story as a framing device. Thanks for listening to Writer's Digest Presents. Join us in May when we'll be talking about world building. Until then, you can visit writersdigest.com for more writing prompts, advice, and inspiration. And search for us on social on the usual platforms. Email us at writers.digest@aimmedia.com to share your feedback. We look forward to hearing from you.